To begin, we will start with our first panel, G2 World and the U.S.-China rivalry. On this panel will be our keynote speaker, Professor John Sigronis of the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C., Dr. Miles Yu, Senior Fellow and Director of the China Center at the Hudson Institute, Professor Michael Rainsborough from the Australian War College, and Dr. David Morris, Senior Fellow from the Center of China and Globalization. And our moderator will be Danube Institute's own Dr. Eric Hendricks. Gentlemen, please welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Logan. The Prime Minister Orbán recently poetically described the geopolitical situation in the 21st century by telling the audience, "Look up to the sky and behold, in the sky there are two suns." And he was referring to China and the United States. Now, he also mentioned that a small country such as Hungary, in the center of Europe, is not playing in that, what he calls, big boy category. But as was already mentioned, referred to in the opening remarks, in the welcoming remarks, it may offer certain epistemic benefits to have a partial outside perspective on this competition. Now, first, a few questions are immediately manifesting here. The first is, are we in fact in a duopolar world order? And then the second question is, if so, how do we manage this situation? If you have two suns in the sky, how do we keep the geopolitical stage from overheating? And what are these two great powers? They're very different. They have different political system. They have very different characteristics. What are their gravitational pulls? What are their powers? What planets are in their orbit? And today we have four distinguished speakers on this topic. And I first would like to welcome either to the stage, or if you like to be seated, but probably the stage, Professor Sigronis for the keynote speech.
Good morning. I'm truly honored to have been invited back to Budapest, to the Danube Institute, and to this amazing venue, which someone last year described as a movie set for a James Bond film. And I can imagine that. John and Melissa, co-directors of MI6, moving headquarters from Vauxhall Cross in London. You're all familiar with the iconic kind of big Lego building on the banks of the Thames, moving down here to Budapest to preserve the Western alliance and fight off the evil forces of those who are attacking Western civilization. But yesterday, I have to admit, I was listening to Nevin and George and John, and looking out now, it's almost like a meeting of Spectre. You know, the special executive for counterintelligence, terrorism, revenge, and extortion, and we're reporting to one, John and Melissa, and it's almost as if Nevin, that iconic voice of some nondescript country, maybe Germany, and the voice says, "Number 2 report on the monetary fall of the West and the economic downfall of America." And then you get George, number 3, report on the disposition of Russian missiles in Ukraine and Russia. And then John's last presentation, number 4, report on the decline of America's military arsenal. I truly want to thank John and Melissa for you are number 1. You are wonderful and engaging, very hospitable hosts, and I'm very pleased to be here. But I also want to thank Logan Luca. I don't know where Luca, I don't even know if I've ever met Luca, but she's been so instrumental in arranging this conference. Who've made this a very special gathering. I mean this sincerely. I know, having myself long ago labored through invitations and travel and hotel accommodations for guest speakers, and then all the preparations that go into a conference such as this, and then the hot wash that's going to materialize afterward. I'm really very appreciative, and I'm sure all of us are as well. It's an added pleasure for me to be acquainted with old friends, some of whom I've long ago met or worked with or simply get to see again after some time apart. Jim Carafano, certainly from Heritage. Jim, it's good to see you. Glad I met you on the plane in Munich. We made it here. John Venable, Scooter Libby. I was surprised to see Scooter. I don't even see you. Is Scooter here? There he is. Scooter, my old friend Mike Duran, who was my colleague on the NSC staff, many others, and I'm very honored to be here. It didn't take much convincing for me to accept John and Melissa's invitation. Nonetheless, Melissa, quite cleverly, as she's wont to do, tempted me, and given my competitive spirit and strong sense of patriotism, to comment on something that Hungarian President Viktor Orbán said recently, and Eric just mentioned this, in effect, that there are two suns in the sky that the US and China must accept and manage this new bipolarity, and that they must prevent this rivalry from overheating. Well, as is his way, I'm sure the president intended to be provocative, and if so, he succeeded. But if not, and he truly believes that the current geopolitical landscape is indeed orbiting around two suns of, I don't know what, equal warmth and inspiration, I suppose, then I firmly believe he is wrong, and dangerously so. The comment, the analogy, is reminiscent of the balance of power political thinking that endured for much of the Cold War, promoted most effectively by the widely revered, and I admit deservedly so, Dr. Henry Kissinger, who even today, at 100 years old, holds a similar view regarding the United States and China, that to ensure peaceful engagement and avoid war, our leaders must negotiate and maneuver in a refined diplomatic dance of sorts that preserves a balance of power. In effect, it's diplomacy without a moral compass. And yet, thankfully, it is not to Kissinger, but to Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Pope John Paul, whom the world owes the greatest debt of gratitude for rejecting Kissinger's notions of balance of power in so-called spheres of influence, for rejecting any sense of moral equivalence between democratic and autocratic regimes, for recognizing that totalitarian regimes suppress the human spirit, for recognizing that they are evil. Yes, totalitarian regimes are evil. Because of them, not the regimes, but Reagan, Thatcher, and John Paul, their leadership, their statesmanship grounded by a moral courage we rarely see today, the Cold War ended. And millions were freed and remain so today. I don't think the Hungarian president has lost his mind. He may simply have forgotten his history. President Orbán's comment suggests that there is a similar, almost moral equivalence again, that the US and China are simply competitively engaged across a broad global operational environment, as we would say in the military, and perhaps that the US is reluctant to accept China's ascendancy as an emerging power, that the US might have to acknowledge its relative decline and accept that some may be attracted to the gravitational pull of the Chinese regime, its rapid economic and technological growth, its military advances and projection of force, and even the perception that security and surveillance of a nation's people is preferred to freewheeling democratic societies. In essence, more security and less liberty is the more attractive model for governance when so much in the world seems to be in chaos. The evidence for this attraction, to which he and others might refer, is compelling, at least initially. Let me explain. China's substantial investments, financial, technical, diplomatic, in the Belt and Road Initiative and the Digital Silk Road are portrayed by China and perceived by many in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and even here in Europe, as benevolent infrastructure projects to be integrated on a global scale for broader economic growth and development, the ability to deliver more services, more effective public services, improve commercial efficiencies, modernize telecommunications, and promote green energy, to name a few. Some have argued these investments are no different than the U.S. Marshall Plan for Europe's recovery after World War II, or the large-scale infrastructure projects of the 1960s advocated by the U.S. international development community. Today, the European Council, probably encouraged by the French, has gone so far as to argue that Europe is now in the position to pursue a policy of strategic autonomy, pursuing neither too strong an attachment nor aversion to either the United States or China. In space, China impresses with its near-peer capabilities for manned spaceflight, mission extension operations, deep space exploration, and its global network satellite system, BeiDou, as a reliable alternative to GPS, GLONASS, Galileo, and Starlink. One cannot ignore nor fail to be impressed by the qualitative improvements and quantitative growth of China's military. It currently deploys the world's largest navy. Quantity does have its quality. Virtually indefensible hypersonic missiles, an alarming strategic triad, and it continues to adopt cutting-edge stealth, autonomous, biological and genetic, artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies. China is nearly, as we saw yesterday, is nearly every nation's leading trading partner and is asserting a more prominent diplomatic role, mediating Saudi-Iranian relations and orchestrating the agendas of the China-Africa, China-Latin America, China-Arab States Fora, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Jiangshan Security Forum. A generous, but I contend ignorant view, ignorant as in one is simply doesn't know, not that one is stupid, although that could be too, of these developments is that China is simply pursuing opportunities to expand its economy, invest in others for mutual benefit, accrue wealth, invest that wealth in all its elements of national power, and assert that power as an emergent global leader to influence worldwide engagements peacefully. If only it were that simple and benign. In its own words, Chinese leadership, the Chinese Communist Party, is pursuing, quote, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese state, understood, I think, to mean something like making China great again. I guess greater freedom of maneuver, greater independence from interference, presumably from the West, the United States, to shape a new world order where China enjoys, quote, superordinate influence and, quote, partial hegemony. Partial hegemony? Why stop there? Looking under the hood, so to speak, China's actions belie its true intentions. The road, rail, maritime, and air transportation corridors emerging from the BRI essentially are designed so that all roads lead to Beijing, reducing its reliance on the long-established international trade and commercial routes upon which it has long benefited. To secure supply chains and bypass choke points it deems vulnerable to a future conflict with the United States, to penetrate markets and extract its resources, timber, ore, minerals, oil, fish, to feed its economy and its people, and to employ them. To possess assets if financial terms cannot be met, so-called debt trap financing. To enable its military to project more broadly and to maintain a more constant presence. The digital Silk Road similarly envisions all routers leading to Beijing. Build and capture the world's telecommunications and computer networks by offering 5G. Incidentally, 6G is being drawn up as we speak. And AI architectures while exfiltrating and exploiting, in effect, mining the world's data, the real coin of the realm. Steal competitive intellectual property. Construct a highly restricted intranet. Digital authoritarianism. And block numerous applications, such as Gmail, Dropbox, Microsoft OneDrive, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, BBC, CNN, Amazon, Wikipedia, WhatsApp, Signal, Skype, Viber, and now iPhones. All this while lobbying for the unrestricted use of TikTok in the United States and the non-Chinese version of TikTok. Rather than complement the existing satellite constellations by the US, European, or Japanese that have until now collectively benefited everyone, China launched its own isolated and restricted system and has positioned itself to neutralize the operations of all the others. But perhaps most alarming, certainly for a national security strategist, is China's secret transition recently exposed from its long-standing nuclear posture of minimal deterrence to a counterforce deterrence, the rapid expansion and modernization of its nuclear triad, bombers, missiles, and submarines that far exceed what we call sufficiency requirements. China is constructing a first strike strategic breakout nuclear capability. And the US, for the first time, must confront two strategic nuclear powers simultaneously. Why? Why all this? The late Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's extraordinary statesman and insightful student of China, asserted that China has reawakened its sense of identity, of destiny, to be an honorary member of the West, to not be an honorary member of the West, and led by the United States, which it sees as spiritually exhausted, physically weak, and no longer capable of carrying the world. Were others to see the United States in the similar light, an image China does its best to illuminate, it would not be surprising that we seem to be the weaker son, unattractive, and diminishing. I find it rather revealing that China views us as no longer capable of carrying the world. We never aspired to carry the world, but clearly the Chinese do. We are to blame. For 50 years, we sought to engage, to invest in, to encourage economic growth in China, to support its ascension to the World Trade Organization, to share our technologies, to promote a freer society, even after Tiananmen. Our long-standing policies did not lead to the political reform, openness, and peaceful development. They merely strengthened the CCP's and PLA's hold onto power, as was always the party's intention. Kai Xia, former professor at the Central Party School of the CCP, a former educator of the party elite, tells us that the CCP never intended to reform politically, nor assimilate into the global commons as a responsible participant. Where we saw opportunities in what has become an emerging economic competitor, the CCP never assumed we were anything but an adversary. Where we respect truth, rules, and contracts, there is no spirit of contracts and fairness in China, which has mastered the art of indirectness and deception. I refer you to the Department of Justice, U.S. Department of Justice indictments that describe organizations such as Huawei and their unbridled effort to steal intellectual property and technologies in the United States. We should have listened to Michael Pillsbury some 25 years ago when he cautioned us about the Chinese view of future warfare, and less of Henry Kissinger, who, despite his unparalleled access to the most senior Chinese leadership for 50 years, failed to understand them. We have moral confusion. We have forgotten, or worse, ignored, the CCP's history of repression and mass murder. CCP, I'm not talking about the Chinese people, but CCP, mass murder, the Red Guards, Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward. We ignore the forced labor camps, Laogai, the oppression of minorities, the reneged commitments on Hong Kong, the persistent lies regarding the militarization of the South China Sea, and the shameful deception regarding the outbreak of COVID, to say nothing of China's response to it for the world. If our culture, our moral traditions, our founding principles of governance matter to us, are we not then concerned of a relationship with a state that is policed by a political party that demands unquestioned discipline and loyalty, that is intentionally godless and undemocratic, that demands an oath from party adherents to the very same, a one-party dictatorship, one doctrine, one party, one leader, one nation, a Han nation, the center around which all else evolves. Exceptionalism, I call it, in Chinese characteristics. What do we do? Currently, our policies in the United States are rather incoherent, inconsistent, and they lack consensus. None of these afflict the CCP, interestingly enough. We are, I'm sad to say, directionless, reactive, and leaderless. This cannot be attractive to our friends and allies. With respect to incoherence, think about some of the policies that we've pursued. Do we engage? Do we decouple? Do we de-risk? Do we confront? Do we deter? Do we compete? When he was vice president, now President Biden said, when asked, China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. I mean, you know, they're not bad folks. I'm speechless. This of a country that practices wolf warrior diplomacy and three warfares against us. We're inconsistent. Anyone looks at the political movement in the United States, from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden, wherever we're going to go in 2024, I don't know. I'm afraid. Certainly violently so if Harris. Okay. We lack consensus among our leaders, our policymakers, our analysts, our scholars, business people, citizens of a constitutional republic. How is the United States to overcome this? I've learned that efforts to devise one strategy, an all-encompassing strategy to address many objectives, are elusive and impractical. But well-integrated strategies of more modest objectives can be successful. To deal with China, I suggest three. First, shine and shame. This is essentially a policy of enforced reciprocity that plays to our strengths and focuses on their weaknesses. Expose the CCP's pervasive espionage campaigns that target our political leadership, our corporations, and our social fabric, whether it's exfiltration of data or the far more subtle efforts to psychologically disarm us by targeting our academic institutions, our social media, or the entertainment industry, all of which form our perceptions of China and ourselves. We must expose their methods and address the consequences of our neglect. Regarding shame, I suggest a persistent public diplomacy offensive that turns their wolf warrior diplomacy, assertive, aggressive, confrontational approach, and three warfares, public opinion, psychological warfare, and legal warfare, on their heads. Expose the parties' lies and draw them out to explain their transgressions. We have become too complacent and accommodating. Secondly, invest more and far more wisely in the economic development of friends and allies with whom we share common aspirations. Establish technical alliances that mirror our security alliances. For example, telecommunications and the cyber domain partnerships that successfully compete with the national champions that China underwrites. We must provide better alternatives to the China Belt Road and Digital Silk Road and not merely dismiss them. The BRI is estimated to have a price tag of roughly $600 billion these last 10 years. We in the United States expended nearly $5 trillion in Afghanistan and Iraq. And what do we have to show for it? What could we have done differently with $5 trillion? I leave that to your imagination. Rather than disparage the BRI and DSR, piggyback on them. They build a port, we build a warehouse. They build roads, we build hotels along them. In essence, integrating our projects with theirs eliminates their ability to operate independent of oversight and calls them, as in poker, to lay their cards on the table, show their hand. I recognize the challenges with this approach. We are fiscally inept, but continuing to do what we do in the manner we do and expect a different outcome is foolish. Finally, we certainly in the United States must get our own house in order. Paraphrasing Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, small republics are destroyed by foreign forces, if large, by internal vice. We have more than enough vice and must attend to a number of things. Civic education and a renewed sense of civility, political leadership that is wise and not noisy, serving petty factions and identity politics, financial responsibility. Indebtedness is like walking in cement shoes. We need to restore our strategic deterrence. The United States has long kindled the human spirit to be creative, to be free, of thought and expression, to prosper, to pursue one's own ambitions. We mustn't lose sight of that. More than simply a place or the aggregate of its people, the United States is an idea, an exceptional one, I believe. A shining city upon a hill, perhaps, or a bright and warming sun that attracts and inspires others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Yu, please take the stage, if you will.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And I love Hungary, first time here, and I know that there are so many things that I have learned. First and foremost was you have this incredibly hot and potent liquor I had last night. It was unbelievable. It reminds me of the Chinese Mao Tai. So it's even more, it's like a lighter fluid, you know. I don't have a PowerPoint because I'm one of the very few individuals who believes that power corrupts, PowerPoints corrupt, absolutely. So let me just Istvan this morning talk about encouraging discussion and disagreement. Let me just say a few words that about. I just want to share some points with you about the some ideas. First of all, G2. This idea of somehow China and the United States dominates the world stage. All the major geopolitical matters will be decided in Washington or Beijing. Is in high fashion. Mostly, you have some intellectuals from universities like Harvard who promotes the idea of the Thucydides trap that basically says the United States is a power that's in decline. China is the power that's in ascendance. Therefore, there is a inevitable, inexorable confrontation within somewhere 50 yards from us. So this is basically the idea of the Thucydides trap. Well, we heard that we're being introduced the idea that your prime minister said that there are two suns in the sky. And first of all, that's fundamentally anti-Newtonian universal law. You cannot have two suns in the same planet. But let me just share some thoughts with you. The idea, as you see my bio, let me just share one story with you. I promise you I will have a conclusion here. You read in my bio, I worked in the previous administration as the principal China policy advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. One day, there was one office from the in the State Department. They spend millions of taxpayers' dollars doing the global survey. So they came to me and said, Mr. Yu, I think you should tell Mr. Pompeo that we have just concluded a very comprehensive global survey. The result is that popularity of China globally is really, really rising, and the United States is in decline. I said, well, this is very interesting. Tell me more. He said, well, with a few exceptions, that China is catching up with the United States in terms of popularity in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia. I said, that's very odd. You know, just tell me who are the few exceptions? And he said, oh, no, it's not very important. The numbers are very small. I said, no, just tell me. Tell me the exceptions. He said, okay, if you insist. He began to list. Okay, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, India, Philippines, and Australia. Those were exceptions where China is very, very unpopular in these countries. I said, you have spent taxpayers' money. You come to the wrong conclusion. The conclusion is not China is popular in the world. The conclusion should be whichever country that deals with China more, China will become less popular. The more China deals with you, and less popular China will become. The reason is because the Chinese model of governance, of international engagement, is a fundamentally anti-democratic, fundamentally anti-freedom, and fundamentally unworkable. So I heard Mr. Orbán, who just left, saying that the United States had this sort of moral audacity to lecture us and then dictate our policy. Those are fine. Those are harsh criticism. Your ambassador to Washington, D.C. told me in my face that the United States posed a bigger threat to Hungary than China. Those are very offensive statements. But I understand that because we're allies, we're friends. Criticism is fine. But you cannot say the same thing about China. Try Lithuania, right? So this is a difference between the model of governance of the United States and China. So ultimately, the G2 world reference is kind of sort of okay, but it's not China versus the United States. It's China versus the rest of the world. That's my point number one. There is a very powerful and polling agency in the United States called Pew. Every politician follows that, right? Because democracy follows popular opinion. Pew just conducted a 24-country global survey about China's popularity, Hungary included. Of the 24 countries globally, China's unpopularity averaged 67%. In other words, in all the countries surveyed, China's unfavorable rating is 67%. The only country in Eastern Europe where China's popularity is bigger than unpopularity is Hungary. You have 52% of people in this country surveyed that view China favorably, 50% unfavorably, right? So I'm not saying this is heart of darkness, but this is pretty discouraging, right? So we need more to, so we have to realize that ultimately you are dealing with a country that is globally unpopular. It's not just the United States versus China. It's China versus the rest of the world. That's my point number one. Number two, I listened to many speakers yesterday and over the chit-chat and coffee clutches since I came here. And there is a pervasive feeling of defeatism that the Western democracy is not going to match up with China's power. The funny thing is, if you are in Beijing, the sense of paranoia, the sense of weakness and helplessness is much, much bigger than the kind of pervasive defeatism we feel in the West. Because that regime is built upon the profound paranoia. That regime is paranoia, is based upon one single fact, that is, it is not a legitimate regime. Its biggest fear is its own people. Right? So I work in the Trump administration. The single most violent reaction from Chinese government to the United States is just one sentence Secretary of State Mike Pompeo uttered in November 2019 at the Hudson event in New York City. In the speech, which I helped draft, Mr. Pompeo said one sentence. Toward the end of the speech, he said, the Chinese Communist Party is not the same as the Chinese people. The Chinese government went berserk next day. Because this challenge is legitimacy. That's the biggest fear. The reason this is very important because we have to understand Chinese regimes' weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Right? Because it doesn't have political legitimacy. And in terms of economic power, in terms of military power, yes, China has made tremendous advances in the last 20-some years. Right? That's not because of Chinese Communist Party's virtue. It's almost in spite of it. Because China has been embraced into the global international trading system, which China really doesn't deserve, which I'll elaborate a little bit later. So this is a really, really important point for us to really keep in mind. China lives in fear and paranoia because it does not have legitimacy. If you look at Xi Jinping living in China, I think what keeps her up every night is whether the Chinese people are going to go up in arms and create some trouble for this. That's what it is. The reason the United States become the number one threat to the Chinese Communist regime is because the Chinese Communist Party's biggest fear is that the United States, which holds the incredible inspirational power for the Chinese people. If every Chinese identify with American values and principles, the Communist Party is finished. That's why their persistent effort by the party is always try to distort the virtues of democracy. They fear most. Talk about lecture in the United States. In the early month of Biden administration, the Chinese diplomatic czar, Yang Jiechi, and then Foreign Minister Wang Yi came to Anchorage, Alaska, lecture the new Secretary of State Blinken and the new National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Their harangue, their diatribe is not about American policies or hawkish or dovish. Their diatribe is about the fundamental flaws of American democracy. They said to the American senior officials, the American democracy is far inferior to the Chinese Communist Party's all-process democracy. Now, how ridiculous that is. This is the same time Chinese government lock up millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps, right? Have this most advanced, technologically capable surveillance state over there. So that's why their fear is about Americans' institutional, political inspiration upon the Chinese people. That's why we're enemies. That's why U.S. is really big threat to them. It's not because of our policies, it's because the very existence of the universal values represented, championed by American government is threatened to them. Okay, so that's another thought. The Chinese government also conducted foreign policy with incredible intransigency. They are so inflexible. You cannot really say anything negative about them. You cannot even criticize them. The Prime Minister of Australia said, you should really allow international team to go to China to investigate the origin of COVID. China just also went bananas and decided, no, we're going to stop importing Australian wine and stop importing Australian coal. So over the years, I have developed some kind of very terrible habits, addictions, because when China bans something, I start drinking doing this, right? So I start drinking Australian wine, and I started eating Taiwanese pineapples, and you name it. So it's just endless. Yeah. So that's why what I do now. But the intransigency also is vulnerabilities. We have our distinguished Taiwanese ambassador here in the audience today. You cannot go to any meeting with the Chinese senior leadership without them spending wasting your time talking about Taiwan. That intransigency is very, very important. The country that in the world that deals with China knows this kind of Chinese vulnerability, intransigency, very well is a country you would never imagine. It's Iran. Remember, Iranians were very, very mad for China going over Saudi Arabia, signing some deals, because Iran had just signed a $400 billion 25-year deal with China. So Iran considered this as some kind of perfidy. So Iranians, all they did was just run a headline in one of its national newspapers. Iranian people will support Taiwanese independence. China just went absolutely panic. So they rushed to Iran and to amend the relationship. That is something we could use. China has been bullying everybody over the issue of Taiwan. You cannot say anything good about Taiwan. You change the name of the plaque, an official office there, and they were going to record your ambassador. So that's basically something, if I were in a powerful position, I would say, okay, I'll switch recognition to Taiwan. So what can you do about me? This is also, small countries have better advantage in doing so. So what I'm saying is China is vulnerable. China has many intransigencies. We have to really get rid of the idea that China is invincible, that China is doing everything right. No, they're blunders. They blunder left and right, up and down. I mean, look at this. China is a near pariah state on COVID origin, on war in Ukraine, right? China's basically practice of wolf warrior. Those were terrible things. So this is why we have to be very self-aware about our advantage. We have to have our confidence in ourselves. The reason Mr. Blinken, the reason Mr. Sullivan did not really mount a robust attack to Chinese lecturing is because Chinese knew our rhetoric. They knew that the Democrats believe that America is systematically racist They knew that Democrats' official platform is believed as fundamentally flawed in our system. So that's why they knew our weaknesses and vulnerabilities. So we have to be absolutely confident in our own system, in the democratic and in the gospel of freedom. So that's why the only way you can deal with that is to have self-confidence in yourself. Now, on Taiwan, there's also another issue that we cannot really overestimate the Chinese power. We have taken it very seriously. We always suppose the worst scenario. I mean, think about this, right? If China wants to do any military actions in Asia Pacific, it's not just about one particular spot. It's the beginning of a chain of reaction. Taiwan literally is China's Sudetenland today. Hitler would never stop at Sudetenland. He will go on. The logic of aggression is the same. If China is allowed to take Taiwan, who knows what's going to be next? Vietnam, Japan, India, the Philippines, right? So it's never going to stop. That's why the stake for the defense of Taiwan is so big, so huge, just as the stake for the defense of Ukraine is very important to Europeans. Because Putin and Xi Jinping share exactly the same logic of aggression. Putin invaded Ukraine because he doesn't believe Ukraine has nationhood. He doesn't believe Ukraine has independence. He only believes that as long as the country or the regional country have shared ethnic and linguistic heritage, therefore, it's legitimate for me to intervene. Think about what China thinks about Taiwan. Exactly the same thing. 95% of people in Taiwan speak Chinese. They eat Chinese food. Therefore, I have a right to intervene. So this is why it's very important. But if you think about this, precisely because of that, China's military action in the region is conditioned, restrained by many factors. Number one, I don't know how many of you have been following the U.S. Military commentaries. They have been, okay, great. So they have been talking about timeline. At what time China will invade Taiwan, 2027, 2025. Those are basically, don't pay attention to that. Because fundamentally, I don't know how many of you watch the old American TV show Columbo. Detective show, right? Columbo solved every case with three factors: motive, means, and opportunities. China has the motive to invade Taiwan. China has believed it has the means to do so, but China may not have the opportunities. Opportunities not determined by China, is by the rest of us. If we show resolve, we deny China opportunity, that won't happen. So we actually have this upper hand to decide the timeline of Chinese communist behavior, right? Also cost. Just like the war in Ukraine, we have to make China realize the cost, political cost, economic cost, financial cost, technological cost is going to be prohibitive. Because unlike Russia, China is much, much more dependent on its connection engagement with the international free trade system. So we can do that. Thirdly, China, listen, Taiwan, Vietnam, Japan, they're not just China's ultimate goal. China has a global ambition. So you have to really understand China must take into consideration any military adventure in Asia Pacific. How would that connect it to its global strategy? And that is really important for us to understand. And another thing is, China is a country ruled by fiat, right? You have this major war going on. How does that do to political stability? And it's going to be very important. But most importantly is the world, led by the United States, show our strategic clarity to defend Taiwan. And for that, I have to give both administration, Republican and Democrats, credit for showing absolute necessity to defend Taiwan. The President Biden has said four times, if China invades Taiwan, we'll do it militarily. I heard some pessimism yesterday about our military inadequacy. I mean, for those people who don't have access to the high side, I don't really pay attention to that kind of pessimism. The whole point here I'm trying to make is that the future of the world is not in Beijing. So we have to really be confident about ourselves, about the power of freedom and power of democracy. Ultimately, it's a completely complete unworkability of the Chinese Communist Party's model of governance. Thank you.
Professor Rainsborough, well, this panel is indeed getting fairly heated with those suns, either one or two in the sky. Please, Professor Rainsborough.
Good morning, everyone. I am deeply corrupted by PowerPoint, as you can see. Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you to the Danube Institute and the Heritage Foundation for inviting me here to beautiful Budapest. Before I start, just a very quick caveat. Please note that I'm speaking in a personal capacity, and my remarks should not be taken in any way as a reflection of the views of the Australian Department of Defence or any other branch of the Commonwealth of Australia. And by the end of my talk, you will probably see why. This is well, I was asked to speak on the topic of the return of grand strategy in the Indo-Pacific in the light of the Russia-Ukraine war. Obviously, it's a vast topic. Let's see if I can, yes. It's a huge topic, so obviously it's only possible to deal with this in the briefest of ways. I think the way to start is really to just examine this notion of grand strategy. Grand strategy never really went away in the region. It's simply that the Ukraine war has brought pre-existing geopolitical tensions to the surface, and it's represented them in much sharper and aggravated forms, which I do think presage quite serious fault lines in the regional and global order. Perhaps it could be said that that a realistic understanding of geopolitics only went away in the sense that global idealists at the end of the Cold War, so-called, whatever you want to call them, neoconservatives, neoliberals, international ethicists, who managed to capture the commanding heights of US foreign policy making, believed that the world was embarked on a liberal democratic end of history. Nevertheless, idealistic though this vision might be, it can be said that it has in many senses represented the grand strategy of the West for some 3 decades, in that it holds that Western forces should intervene militarily if necessary in countries in order to mold regions towards a rules-based liberal international order that, coincidentally or not, broadly aligns with US economic and security interests. And we can see this grand strategy manifesting all the way from the Gulf War of 1990, 1991, various humanitarian interventions, notably in the Balkans in the 1990s, through to interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Arguably, this grand strategy was also realized in NATO's eastward expansion since the end of the Cold War, which has reached its crescendo, or its denouement, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which some maintain with some plausibility was partially provoked by NATO's eastward expansion. We can debate whether this policy is prudent or wise, but it undoubtedly represents a grand strategic enterprise on the part of the West. So the question is, after the invasion of Ukraine, what has been the geopolitical fallout for countries on the periphery of this conflict in the Indo-Pacific? Well, to state the obvious, the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war is that it has forced a great power dividing line between the overt supporters of Russia, and its chief backer, China, and the supporters of Ukraine, behind which stand the powers of the US and the West more generally. The US appeal states that countries need to choose between freedom and tyranny, as represented by President Biden's Warsaw speech of March 2022, that democracies must unite in the fight against autocracy. It's time to choose a side. Are you with Putin and China, or are you with the people of Ukraine and the struggle for democracy and national sovereignty? The way this plays out in the Indo-Pacific is largely as a proxy for China's great power aspirations, particularly the degree to which China might wish to forcibly reclaim Taiwan in the way that Russia has attempted to do with Ukraine, and the more broader extent to which China is seeking to strong-arm its way to regional dominance by quashing democracy in Hong Kong, oppressing its minority populations, forcefully asserting its claims in the South China Sea, extending its quasi-imperial reach through the Belt and Road Initiative, and so on. The fact that China supports Russia in the conflict suggests, if we are to employ Biden's ideological lens, that the world is confronted by an axis of autocracy of China and Russia and its supporters, and an axis of democracy represented by the US and its various allies, notably in the Indo-Pacific, being Japan and Australia. So for powers that are not formally allied to either of these axes, the geopolitical challenges are complex. What you have in many cases in the Indo-Pacific arena are degrees of alignment where countries exist in a condition of geopolitical ambiguity, with nations either leaning to or away from these axes, largely depending on their geostrategic position, upon their political traditions, and their perceived national interests. So what you have in the Indo-Pacific are degrees of association with one side or the other. Leaning towards the axis of autocracy, most obviously are the countries of Central Asia. These states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, they're caught between the competing geopolitical interests of Russia and China. Regardless of what they might think of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they are predisposed not to be critical of Russia's actions, being reliant on Russia for economic support, particularly energy supplies, but also because these regimes in these countries are themselves one-party dominant states and rely, as the Kazakh government did recently, on the intervention of Russian security forces to ensure the continuing rule of the regime. Equally, these countries are deferential to Chinese interests and the economic pull of China's Belt and Road investments. All of these countries, with the exception of Turkmenistan, function within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the world's largest economic and security cooperation group, containing 60% of the Eurasian landmass and 40% of the world's population. In 2017, the SCO expanded to include India and Pakistan. It admitted Iran in 2023 and maintains dialogue partners from across the rest of Asia and the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and the UAE. So this is a major developmental defense and security arrangement through which many countries now orbit Russia and China. In contrast, the states of the Asia-Pacific littoral, Japan, South Korea, much of Southeast Asia, are primarily concerned with the implications of the spread of Chinese power and influence in the region, and so naturally tilt towards the Western line and the so-called axis of democracy. The Ukraine war merely sharpens the sense of insecurity in relation to the more assertive line that Xi Jinping's regime promotes to restore China to a position of global preeminence. These countries seek to offset China's influence via institutions such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad, comprising Australia, Japan, the US, and India, which seeks to reaffirm, according to its joint statement of March 2022, its commitment to an Indo-Pacific in which the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states is respected and countries are free from military, economic, and political coercion, all of which we can take as a not so loosely aimed swipe in the direction of China. These sentiments are broadly in accord with most of the rest of the nations that comprise the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, that by degrees of hedging and strategic ambiguity tend, on the whole, to bend towards the West. India is a member of the Quad and historically has had a fractious relationship with the PRC. But nevertheless, when it comes to the impact of Ukraine on its foreign policy, leads to some interesting pointers in terms of where the diplomatic wind might be blowing. India represents a third diplomatic dimension as a major regional power and doesn't feel any compulsion to necessarily choose a side, but preserves the latitude to lean to or away from these axes as befits its national interest. Indian foreign policy is heir to a historical tradition of non-alignment during the Cold War, and this trend has been sharpened in the post-Cold War era, where India also regards itself as a major regional force to be reckoned with, and therefore free to chart its own path in world affairs. And over the war in Ukraine, this has led to tensions with the US, which demands, as India sees it, to take its side against Russia. And the pushback from India is most forcefully expressed by its External Affairs Minister, Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, who makes the point that India should not be made to feel that Europe's problems are its problems, especially when the sense is that the West may have helped to create the conditions that led to the invasion of Ukraine in the first place. This, India and indeed other states, both within and beyond the Indo-Pacific, feel that they should not be asked to choose sides, and they resent it when they are imposed upon to do so. So what we are seeing going on here is a set of multiple dynamics, both obvious and less obvious. Firstly, and most obviously, the Ukraine war has undoubtedly forced a dividing line of sorts among states in the region, causing some states to align with one or other of these geopolitical axes. However, beyond those states that are formally allied to or obviously bound up very closely to one or other of these power blocks, in the West case, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, or the Central Asian states with respect to Russia and China, the responses of other states have been much more ambiguous. As I have implied, part of this ambiguity reflects diplomatic traditions of hedging and non-alignment that you see across the Indo-Pacific, especially in Southeast Asia. However, I can't help sensing that some of this ambiguity also speaks to a loss of status and prestige, and indeed economic clout, that the collective West has suffered because of the follies and hubris embedded within its version of Western grand strategy. This has resulted in some instances of a kind of grudging, and in some cases not so grudging, respect for both Russia and China for standing up for their national interests and civilizational codes against what is perceived to be a liberal imperialist crusade that has seen the West intervene militarily or politically meddle in countries over the decades, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, but also including Ukraine. Many factors are in play here. In particular, the blow to Western prestige wrought by the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021, the deindustrialization and economic weakening of the West over 30 years caused by neoliberal economics and the outsourcing of manufacturing capacity to cheaper labor markets elsewhere, the follies of net zero and the ceding of energy self-sufficiency to countries like Russia. And in particular, I would highlight the failure of Western financial sanctions against Russia, all combine to make the West look weak, in contrast to the rising and, most importantly, economically and culturally resilient powers of China and Russia, which causes nations to look around them and think, maybe we have options. Maybe we have options here other than to defer to Western interests as we might have had to do in the past. It is, moreover, the sense of Western double standards that multiplies this alienating effect. The Russian invasion of Ukraine strikes us in the West as a clear case of aggression. It gets us up in arms about violations of sovereignty and democracy. But, say many other countries, where were the calls for UN condemnation, sanctions, military intervention, war crimes trials, when it was the West that was invading other countries, knocking over regimes, destabilizing regions, inflicting enormous humanitarian suffering on host populations? It is this enduring perception of double standards embedded in notions like the liberal international order that causes nations to doubt the sincerity of Western commitments to freedom and democracy. Added to this is the sense that liberal imperialism embodies the promotion of liberal modes of governance and lifestyles, and the issue of contending grand strategies in the Indo-Pacific begins to intimate the contours of a clash of civilizations, which causes states to lean towards an axis of autocracy because they don't see the other side as an axis of democracy, but they see it as an axis of hypocrisy. In all of this, one cannot help think but that Western grand strategy, in its liberal imperialist posture, is deeply flawed in its conception and has consequently pursued a particularly inept diplomatic path, especially under this current US administration. Yeah, okay, I'm going to wrap up in a minute. One of the reasons that China backs Russia so assiduously and will not allow it to be defeated in Ukraine is because of the fear that if Russia is defeated and the regime in Moscow is overthrown, that they will be the next target. It doesn't take a strategic genius to work out that this policy is guaranteed to drive Russia and China, despite their geopolitical differences, to back each other to the hilt. A far smarter Western policy, as exercised, I would argue, under the previous US administration, was to be firm but to actively engage in dialogue with these regimes, and which, if Russia had proceeded to invade Ukraine, or if China had made moves against Taiwan, could well have offered possibilities to play off China against Russia, or indeed vice versa. As it is, and I'm coming to a conclusion, as it is, the West's for us or against us attitude tends to alienate far more than it attracts, and not just in the Indo-Pacific. But you're finding that more important regional players like Saudi Arabia and Brazil, along with many parts of Africa and the Middle East, are becoming increasingly estranged from what they see as Western stridency. Moreover, both Russia and certainly China have to some extent, in the eyes of many countries, played it quite cool diplomatically. In the case of China, its appeals for peace talks and a settlement in Ukraine, as opposed to advocating escalation and sending in more weapons, strikes many countries as more reasonable, whether we like it or not. Furthermore, these countries, they look around and they think, not only does this sound more reasonable, but Russia and China aren't threatening us with regime change or sanctions or providing economic investment with all sorts of strings attached. Trade, investment, and non-interference looks very attractive to some countries rather than the ideologically fixated hexering West. Moreover, a West that appears increasingly internally divided between its neoliberal imperialist elites and its own citizenry. So states look around and they think, we have options. Maybe we don't want to overtly align ourselves with China, Russia, or the US. We don't have to. We are truly in a new world order, just not the one that its architects originally envisioned. So in conclusion, in an international system increasingly characterized by a liberal, some might say woke West, or at least its woke elites, and more traditional states of the East and developing worlds, especially in conditions where China is emerging as a strong and dominant power, economically assured about itself in the world, as is Russia to some extent, leads to an uncomfortable realization that it may well be that the world is isolating the West rather than isolating Russia. And I suspect this will be the last time I'll be invited back to the Danube Institute. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. For our final, we now have our final opening statement by Dr. David Morris.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thanks very much to John and Melissa and the others from the Danube Institute. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm always someone who looks for common ground. I think there's common ground in the room, and there's certainly common ground in my region of the world, in Australia, in the Pacific region, in that we do want to have a strong United States, and we do want to have a strong United States presence in the Pacific as a balancing power. There's no doubt that there's a consensus and agreement about that. But I want to start by drawing on Balázs Orbán's comment this morning, which I think is a very interesting one, and I think it resonates with many people around the world, actually, at this particular time in world history, when there is so much change and so much uncertainty. His comments that we want to live at peace, I think, is something we could mostly agree on. What worries me is that there might be some in the major powers who don't necessarily share that view, but I think most of us in the world want to live at peace. I think Balázs Orbán's comment that Hungary, and I think he said more than 100 other countries, would like not just to live at peace, but to be able to pursue their national interest and not to be lectured about their national interest, but to determine their national interest as sovereign countries. And I think that's a very interesting comment for us to reflect upon, because actually the world has changed dramatically in the last 30 years, and I fear that we in the West have misdiagnosed some of the change. I think that, well, let me tell you about my personal story for 1 minute. I was here as a second secretary. I think we have the second secretary of the Australian Embassy here today. That was me 33 years ago. I was here as second secretary in the Australian Embassy and observed what we saw then as this incredible shift in world order. And it was a very exciting time. It was also a very depressing time to see what happened south of the border here. But it was a very important time in world history. And we all drew conclusions about what was happening. Now, one of the conclusions that I think, I still believe, a consensus of the world drew was that markets are a smarter way to run economies than a planned economy. I mean, that was a conclusion that was a shared conclusion from 1989. But there was also a narrative that came out of Washington that America had won the Cold War. That wasn't necessarily the way everyone here in this part of the world saw it. I don't think it's the way that the trade union workers of Solidarity saw it. I don't think it's the way that the Soviet Union, as it collapsed upon itself, totally unexpected by the Central Intelligence Agency. I just don't think it's the way people in this part of the world saw it. It wasn't that America won the Cold War, it was that the Soviet Union lost it. And the Soviet Union had made major mistakes. And so countries beyond the United States never really, in my view, accepted that narrative, that America had won, that America then becomes the unipolar power and can determine the world order. I don't think there was a consensus about that, even in the West. I think we all believe in America and we believe in American power, and many of us despair at America tearing itself apart, destroying its middle class, and the way that it's been mismanaged for the last 30 years and has become diminished in international perceptions. Many of us despair at that. But the analysis that America rules the world and must rule the world and that it has all the answers is just not the way most of the world sees it. And when I say most of the world's population is in the Asia-Pacific region, in Africa, in the Middle East. The world is bigger than just the West. And so we need to be aware of that. Now, we in Australia are very much aware of that because we're next door to Indonesia. We're next door to Papua New Guinea. We're next door to Southeast Asia, to countries and cultures and systems of governance that are nothing like the West. So we don't expect in Australia that we can go and lecture the Indonesians and tell them, you've got to do things the way we do them. You've got to have our values. We just don't expect it. And I think when we looked from the Pacific at what was happening in the last 30 years, we saw a different reality than perhaps the one that people sitting here in the EU, building a very deep and integrated super state that wants to determine a one unified approach to Europe for good or bad, or the way that the United States, sitting in Washington, looked at the world and thought the world's going to be shaped in our image. I think in the Asia Pacific we saw something else. We saw the rise of a middle class of 1 billion people. We saw markets embraced by countries throughout the Asia Pacific, regardless of their system of governance. We saw, however, some common strategies that countries took. They took a state-driven, partnership-driven, sometimes involving some corruption, I have to say, but that's not unique to Asia. We saw an approach taken that was used the smart dimensions of strategic planning. Bring in your industries, plan your industry development, plan your education system and your infrastructure, but use the discipline of markets to then integrate the economies into global value chains. And we saw all of the countries that have been successful in East Asia follow a roughly similar path. They followed the Japanese, the Taiwanese, the Hong Kong and Singapore, and then it became the Korean model, it became the Chinese model. China took this same model of East Asian development and it adapted it. It did it in a way with Chinese characteristics, of course. Vietnam has followed. So most of the countries of East Asia have adopted this market-led, but still state-led approach. And they've been phenomenally successful. So the centre of the world economy now has shifted to East Asia. And it's why for 30 years we talked about the Asia-Pacific region. We used those words very carefully indeed, because it was in the Asia-Pacific that the centre of the world economy was shifting to. And we in Australia, for example, used to talk about the Pacific because it included us and it also included the US. It was very important to include the US in the concept of how we saw a balanced and successful Asian economy going forward. That's been, I think, misdiagnosed. I think there was an expectation in Washington, and maybe increasingly in Europe as well, that as the states of Asia modernised, and not just Asia, but beyond Asia, as development came to Africa and other parts of the world, there was an expectation that countries would not just modernise, but that they'd westernise. Now, why people thought that, I don't know. I'm confused why people thought that China, for example, would westernise. It's beyond my comprehension. China is a 5,000-year-old civilization. It's an absolute monarchy. It's a party state. There's no conception of democratising in China, in today's China. Now, who knows in the future? Maybe the Chinese system of governance will evolve in some way that we might in the future call democratic. I like living in a democracy personally. I'm all in favour of a democracy if we've built it indigenously. But it's not possible to go and impose one, as the US discovered in Iraq, and as the US discovered in Vietnam and numerous other places that it's tried to intervene and has brought war, but has not brought peace and development. Peace and development has come from the last 30 years of global integration and cooperation between countries. The very smart strategy that the United States developed of engaging with China and bringing China into the rules-based system actually worked. It actually worked. China has become integral to the global economy. Now, of course, that means China has become quite dominant in some sectors because of its scale. So this could always have been foreseen. We knew this 30 years ago. Bringing China into the global economy was going to make China a major player. It was to make China, as we used to say, a responsible stakeholder. Well, did it become a responsible stakeholder? It acts like a major power. It has wolf warrior diplomats who talk like some of our Americans talk. It uses this aggressive language. It uses economic sanctions like the United States uses economic sanctions. It's acting like a major power. It's acting rather like the United States in some ways, but it's not invading other countries yet. And this is the question. Is it a yet or is it an ever? We don't know the answer because we are applying Western concepts that China will become like the US, or it will become like European powers, or it will become like the Japanese empire, and it will want to rule Asia. Now, it's a terrifying prospect. Nobody in the Asia-Pacific would want to be living in a Chinese hegemony. Nobody would accept it. Nobody would submit to it. I would suggest to you that even Myanmar would not submit to it, would not submit to a Chinese hegemony. Even Myanmar, even Kazakhstan, which was referred to before, which is very actively developing a multi-vector foreign policy. Kazakhstan that is actively engaging in Belt and Road projects and funding them itself and making sure that it is not in any way dependent upon China. Countries in China's neighbourhood don't want to submit to Chinese hegemony, and I don't think they will. I could be too optimistic, I could be too idealistic, but I think we need to at least have this debate, because I could be proved wrong, but at least let's have the debate that there is an option here. There are different scenarios for how this could pan out, and it just might pan out the way most people in Asia think, and that is that we will end up in a multipolar world where there will be a balance of powers. Now, nobody in China's neighbourhood will let China become a hegemon. India, Japan, Korea, Australia a little bit further away, but we're not going to submit to a Chinese hegemony. It's not even a scenario on our side that is acceptable, but does China even want it? I mean, we hear these very selectively chosen quotes that tell us that China wants this hegemony. I don't see it. I've been studying China for decades. I've lived there as a diplomat. I read every day the Chinese news. And the thing about China is it is an authoritarian system, and it is a party state, and the party sets the narrative, and the narrative gets followed. And while there's lots of chaos underneath, and there are all kinds of crazy things about China, and it's a very diverse place, but there's no doubt the party's in control. And when the party sets out an agenda, when it sets out a plan, that's what it follows. Now, China's language, on my reading, is language about wanting a different kind of world order, a world order that is multipolar, that is based on respecting national sovereignty. Now, that's a challenge, because that has not been the system that the West has imposed upon the world. So China, when it says to the more than 100 countries that Balázs Orbán referred to, when China says we will respect national sovereignty, when China goes to Kazakhstan and says we stand for national sovereignty after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when China says words like that, that doesn't carry the double standard that sadly we in the West carry when we say let's condemn Russia for an invasion, but let's celebrate the US for an invasion. That's seen as a total double standard in the developing world. And the developing world is now the majority. This is the big shift that's occurring. So what do we do about this? Do we double down on rhetoric that's so aggressive and that will lead us inevitably to a war with China, which we will not win? That's my fear. China will sacrifice millions if it has to, but it will not lose to the United States. I'm terrified of a war between China and the United States, and I think we all are in the Asia Pacific. It's very easy to sit in Washington, or Brussels for that matter, and to talk about let's have a war. But it is a real threat to the Asia Pacific, and we lived through the Vietnam War and the disaster of the Vietnam War. We don't want a war between the United States and China. So the emerging world order is going to have a much more powerful China, and China's rhetoric is a very attractive set of narratives to the developing world. And the developing world includes India, it includes Africa, it includes the Middle East, and it includes most of Asia. Now, most of Asia, as I said, will not submit to China, but they're very attracted to the idea of a multipolar world where they're not lectured anymore, where they're not told they must submit to one power. So our challenge here in terms of risk management is how do we ensure that China doesn't become the kind of actor that we're being told it is? How do we ensure that it doesn't become the aggressive hegemon? And I think we've got a large area of common ground. I think we all agree we need a strong United States. We need a strong balance. But what we don't need is language that's aggressive, that is leading us inevitably to war, because actually there are many other scenarios here. And the most realistic, I believe, is a scenario in which the United States and China work in partnership as they have for the last 30 years. Until 2016, we had a very successful cooperation and competition between the two. Now, within the United States, because of poor United States government policies, middle class is declining, manufacturing's going, it's nothing to do with China. The fact that US companies were in China and were earning and bringing profits back to the United States, the fact that America was benefiting from the lower costs of the free trade system, does not mean that the United States should now tear down the World Trade Organization. It should not be blocking the appellate process as it is currently of the World Trade Organization. It should not be diluting the power of the international organizations and the regional trade organizations that actually have served us well. There have been problems. There have been supply chain problems because of a virus, but not because of government actions. I mean, the biggest government actions that actually disrupted supply chains during COVID were the Indian supply chain blockages on medical products. It wasn't actually China. So there's a geopolitical narrative that is painting China as the bad guy, and China is a big power and it is acting like a big power. So it's doing lots of things that we can disapprove of and that we should shine a light on. We should all certainly shine a light on the human rights issues, on questions of how China is acting in its region when it bullies like a major power bullies, just as we would shine a light on other major powers as well when they do so. But I think there's an opportunity for us here when we are discussing things as friends and as people who can enjoy a debate, because we live in societies where we can debate these things. It is worth us exploring what are the different scenarios, what are the opportunities that we have here to actually prevent the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario may still happen, and I may be proved wrong that we're heading towards a war between the United States and China. But if we are, God help us. I mean, it's all very well to talk about God and to tell us that China is godless. But if we are led into a war, God help us, because really the only answer here is for good people to stand up and say, enough, it's time to actually sit down like adults and talk, get into the room, resolve the problems with the World Trade Organization, resolve your problems around security issues that are peripheral security issues in the East Asia region. Sit down and talk about them and develop confidence-building measures and processes that keep people talking, habits of dialogue, habits of cooperation, which is how East Asia has stayed at peace since the Vietnam War, and is how East Asia has prospered through having these processes. They get criticised, ASEAN gets criticised, the APEC gets criticised, they're just talking shops, but they keep people talking and they keep people finding the pragmatic solutions. You sit back and you advocate warfare and distrust and aggression, where does it lead us? So I make a plea that we at least need to have the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that statement, David. As you see, we have an excellent panel here because this is an important topic, and we heard voices that are clearly different from each other on this subject. We're thinking on about how to manage Chinese-American relations in the 21st century, how to maintain order, peaceful order in our world. War needs to be avoided. We want to maintain fruitful relations in the world order. We want to maintain the order, and then the question is, how do you do this? And we have heard of the importance of resolve, standing for your values, being resolute, and we have also heard a more classical diplomatic approach of negotiation, balancing, and a mindful, critical view of de-escalating rhetoric. So we've heard quite some options here. Let me start with Professor Yu. You wanted to respond to Mr. David Morris, I believe.
Yeah. I think, I like this soothing scenario. Let's sit down, kumbaya, avoiding war. But I disagree profoundly the idea that somehow America is imposing its model of governance to the rest of the world. You mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, those were failures. But don't forget, since World War II, we have changed Japan. We changed Germany. And we have many, many successful models, not because America is imposing on that. It's because people demand this, right? You cannot really, you talk about economic development in East Asia. Economic development cannot be separate from democratization. I remember, the United States literally rescued the future president of South Korea by the CIA from the point of being executed. Well, Kim Dae-jung was rescued from here. So we did that, and we also imposed the fair election in the Philippines in 1986. When Marcos assassinated Senator Aquino. So, and we stopped the Dutch from going back to Indonesia in 1949, right? And we basically make sure that Taiwan abandoned its dictatorship. I mean, without the United States, I would not say we're not imperialistic in rhetoric. America has a lot of noises over there, but overall, the basic ethos America is trying to make the world safe for democracy, as Wu was said. So you cannot focus just on Iraq and Afghanistan saying America is hegemon and try to make we want to create a world that is that is a safe democracy, but also with the equal opportunity for commerce, right? So we invest enormously in secure global chain, so sea land of communications, not just for our own sake, but for everybody else, right? Europeans invest enormously on that. We invest heavily in NATO alliance, not because of self-interest alone. I mean, and Europeans woke up in the aftermath of Ukraine. They found themselves in big trouble because they have over-reliance on Russia for energy, over-reliance on China for trade, and over-reliance on the United States for security. That's reality. You guys should realize those things. But the United States is not an imposer, it's a facilitator, right? So that's what I'm saying. I mean, in Asia, now I encounter many diplomats from Southeast Asia. They keep saying, "Don't force us to choose side." The United States, China, we're dependent on China's trade over there. And I listened to them. I said, "Well, this is very odd. They keep saying this, and I get tired of this." And then I gradually realized what it really means is not that we force them to choose side. They are profoundly on the U.S. side, but they're not sure about the policy consistency of the United States. They don't know whether the Trump policy or Biden policy will be consistent when it comes to China. Now they have the guarantee. Biden and the Trump policy on China is pretty much the same, right? So there's different emphasis on that. So that's why I'm saying it's reassuring to say, you mentioned about we created this hawkish rhetoric to provoke war. That's not the case. Now we define the nature of the U.S.-China relationship as a strategic competition. Competition is a very nice, genteel word. This is my criticism of the Biden administration. Competition assumes two things, none of which really is true. One is competition, like any competition, we must have one winner. The Chinese government, gobbledygook, said the win-win is total nonsense. That means win-win to China means China wins twice, we lose twice, right? So that's basically not true. China would never accept being losing to the United States, but that means the demise of the regime. So that's why Xi Jinping keeps talking about, Europeans, you have much better definition than ours. EU said the relationship between EU and China is one of systemic rivalry. Now, I asked Gunnar Wigan a while ago when he was in Washington, D.C., what do you mean by systemic? It's about the width, it's about the coverage, the area. No. It's about political and ideological competition. So EU leadership had this very good idea. So you cannot really get rid of the ideological political differences and talk about economic development alone. So China poses a threat to all of us is not because we don't like we don't like China to develop economically. It's because the very economic model of China threatens everybody. Now, if you listen to you mentioned I agree with totally. There's a lot of talk in the West about China being threatened, and some of the language is pretty tough. But again, I urge everybody to learn Chinese. I urge everybody to read the Chinese to read Chinese leadership statements. In China, every day, they talk about the world, about the United States, is 10 times more hawkish than we're talking about here. Right? It's absolutely crazy. I mean, Xi Jinping's official definition, they talk about repeatedly to define the nature of U.S.-China relationship is one of epic struggle of life and death. 你死我活, right? It's you die or I live. There's no compromise. So that's why the stake is so high for China. Everything is about regime survival, right? So yes, there is a middle class over there, but China is a country with a lot of rich people, but without constitutional guaranteed property rights, right? That's why you have enormous capital flights out of China. You get rich in China, you won't get out of there. So that's really is. So China is not as kumbaya as we think. There's a rising middle class. The middle class in India and middle class in China are fundamentally different, right? So that's why what I'm saying here is I appreciate this idea of associating for peace to avoid war. But the provocator is not the United States, it's not Japan, it's not India, it's not Taiwan. It's China. You cannot really talk to President Putin and say, do not fight a war, let's talk. What if Putin wants to have a war and you have this ultimate decision to make, right? Or avoid the war at any cost, as Mr. Chamberlain did. Or you basically get ready and using your own diplomatic muscles to talk to China and say, war is not good for us, particularly it's not good for you. So that's the message I think both administrations are trying to send to China. Our engagement with China in the last several years is very tense. It's not because we want China to change the regime or anything. It's because we want China to engage with the rest of the world, full spectrum, not just economic, cultural, technology transfer. We have to engage China on intellectual property rights, espionage, and human rights. Full spectrum, just like we deal with every other country. So what I'm saying is, with all due respect, I think the description of America's motive and our modality is very misleading. Thank you.
Just as a small point of clarification also towards the audience, we have 5 great friends of America sitting on this stage. But we do have some disagreements. David, did you wanna reply?
Is that okay? Yes. I think we're in broad agreement on these things. I think I think where the world is in disagreement, and the point I'm making is that the developing world is looking at these things differently. That's the point I'm making. Not that I don't agree with many of the things that have just been said by my friend here, but that the developing world is looking at things differently. And when we build a World Trade Organization and then trash it, we don't look consistent. Now, that's not to say that China isn't sometimes trashing it as well. In particular, their actions towards Australia in recent times is a very good case study in China adopting the economic coercion mode that the US commonly uses against countries to try and change their behaviour. And a very poor example because it turns people against you. That's what it does. It doesn't work. But I think we're in broad agreement here that the United States, in its intentions, does not set out to force people to adapt to its way of thinking. That's certainly its intention, but it's not the way most of the world sees it. And when I say most of the world, this is the point I'm making, that the world order is shifting, and the West, of which I'm a member and of which I'm proud, and I want us to be proud of our values and our achievements as a West, but we have to be careful that we don't assume that we are the world, because we are not. We are a very small proportion of the world. We happen to monopolize the international economy and the international geography for the last couple of 100 years, but that is shifting. And so as we come to terms with that, as I hope we buckle down on actually strengthening our democracies and strengthening our economies and focusing on doing better for ourselves, we have to be careful that we don't put all of our focus on demonizing and creating an enemy, when in fact that country, China, is not very different from Vietnam. We're happy to trade with Vietnam, but we're putting all these sanctions on China. We're trying to stop China's technological rise the same way that all kinds of lids were put on Japan's rise as well 20 or 30 years ago. So we have the ability in democracies to have these debates and to put a spotlight on our own double standards. That right doesn't exist, by the way, in authoritarian societies. So we should be proud of the fact that we can have these debates. I think we should also find our common ground, and there's a lot of common ground here, but we don't need the hostility. It's not going to lead us anywhere, I suspect.
Yes, well, I just echo really more or less everything that David has mentioned, and I think as you say, we're not down on the West. We want to see the West prosper. We want to see the West live up to its best ideals, and in particular, I'm interested in effective strategy. I want to see the West use its resources, diplomatic, military, and economic in the most effective ways possible to achieve realizable ends. And that's my problem with the current composition of Western strategy over the past 30 years. It's not to say that everything that Western foreign policy has ever done, or US foreign policy has ever done, has been bad or wrong or futile. Far from it, as people have mentioned. But as David rightly says, this is not. It's not David and I just sort of saying that the other countries have a quite jaundiced view of Western sort of double standards. It is what they say themselves. We're just trying to relay what we hear all around us, I suspect. So yeah, let me just leave it there. I'm sure other people want to.
Thank you very much. Did you want to say something more?
Yeah, I think the juxtaposition of U.S. versus the developing world is also false. I mean, I mentioned that the Pew poll, many of countries are developing world. So it's not just the U.S. versus the developing world. We're against development. China remain popular mostly in the transactional sense. And many countries in Africa go to China because they want money, right? China finding itself also in its money pit. They cannot support Zimbabwe, Venezuela endlessly. So China, because that's the only thing China has. It doesn't have ideological attractiveness. It doesn't have a value that can be shared with other people. So this idea of China being a benign factor in global international trade system does not ring true to me. You talk about the violation of WTO rules. I mean, look at the cases. I was reading some kind of 50-country joint statement against China's rule sort of a violation in WTO. So at the UN, yes, United States remain very unpopular at UN on human rights and other things. Does that mean we're wrong? You look at the Human Rights Council in the UN. It's a farce, right? Cuba, North Korea, all these guys were in there. So this you cannot say. The reason why there are so many developing countries condemning the United States and criticizing us, because the consequences are very minimal. We're a democracy. You can criticize whatever you want, right? So that's true. But you can if you turn the table, you criticize China. The consequence is enormous, right? It's life and death. So that's why I think it's very unfair to use the word opinion against the United States. We're not perfect. We have a lot of problems. One of the big advantage of being American is you have the right to bitch and moan about your country all the time. So, I mean, that's really important. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, and the debate continues. Can I have a round of applause for all four of our speakers?